Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night to everyone. Like many of you, I once watched Game of Thrones. I eagerly awaited each episode, enjoying the complex characters, intriguing plot, and epic battles. However, the final season left me disappointed. The main issue for me was the sheer stupidity with which everything unfolded in Season 8. The characters became incredibly dumb. Their actions often made me question, why? And the unexpected twists were included just for the sake of being unexpected, ignoring any logical sense.
While Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces, they certainly haven't forgotten about her.
And the Golden Company has arrived in King's Landing, courtesy of the Greyjoy fleet.
A few years passed, and House of the Dragon was released. It frequently references the prophecy related to the White Walkers, and thus to the 8th season of Game of Thrones. And I still clearly remember my disappointment with that finale. So, what is this video about? It's an interpretation of how I envisioned the final season of Game of Thrones. Rewatching what I saw in 2017, I just can't believe what unfolded. Compare it, for instance, with The Lord of the Rings. There, the characters' motivations and actions are backed by cause and effect logic. All actions in the trilogy are justified. As a viewer, you believe in what's happening and forget that it's just a movie, unlike the
While Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
I initially planned to make 6 videos, like the 6 episodes of the 8th season, but in the end, I decided to combine them into 3 parts. This video includes the 1st and 2nd episodes. I wrote the script in a way that it would be perceived as an audiobook. My brother helped me with the visuals. Some locations, like the map of Winterfell, he drew from scratch this summer. So, I recommend viewing this video as an audiobook with illustrations. Imagine that you've just finished watching the 7th season and are starting the 8th, and engage your imagination. The visuals were created to help you picture how it could have looked on the big screen. So, without further ado, I guess enjoy the watching. The attention of the entire kingdom was focused on the north. The call that the army of the dead, led by the legendary creatures known as the Others, or White Walkers, had spread not only across Westeros, but also Essos. Initially, many doubted the truth of these words, considering it a ploy by the king in the north and Queen Daenerys Targaryen. However, as the Night King approached the wall, the days grew shorter and shorter. Everyone anticipated the arrival of winter, but this time it was unlike any other. The winds strengthened, snow fell more frequently, and even the Northmen and wildlings, accustomed to the cold, shivered under the icy breath of the wind. Winterfell became a gathering place for all volunteers who could wield a sword, spear, or bow. The situation was complicated by Queen Cersei, who had divided the country in 2. Storm's End, after the deaths of Stannis and Renly Baratheon and Cersei Lannister's ascension to the Iron Throne, was given to one of the Queen's loyalists. The Reach had been ravaged by Jaime Lannister on the Queen's orders, and most of its nobility joined the Crown Lands. Dorne could not send its forces by land, and the sea routes were blocked by Euron Greyjoy's fleet. Nonetheless, as the rumors of the dead became more credible, some broke their oaths to the Queen and headed to the Neck to join the united forces in the north. Jaime Lannister also decided to head north, disillusioned by his sister's short-sightedness and increasing madness. Using his position, he addressed the Lannister troops, urging them to join him at Winterfell, appealing to the need to set aside old rivalries and unite against the common enemy. His expectations were met, and part of the Lannister army joined their commander. Before the Queen could react, his contingent was already on the King's Road, heading to Winterfell. In the north, events were moving swiftly. Some of the northern forces occupied the empty castles on the wall. They were supported by the remnants of the Night's Watch and the Wildlings. The wall was a formidable fortification, and they planned to confront the army of the dead here. Troops slowly moved from Winterfell to the north. Jon flew Rhaegal along the wall every day, trying to see where the main attack would come. In the 3rd week of preparations, Jon discovered 3 armies of the dead heading to different sections: the Shadow Tower, Castle Black, and Eastwatch by the Sea. The garrison at the Shadow Tower was the smallest, so Daenerys, on Drogon and with part of the army, headed west, while Jon, on Rhaegal, went to Castle Black, where the largest horde of the dead, along with giants and dead mammoths, was advancing. Jon had faced the others at Hardhome and did not underestimate the enemy. Castle Black had become his home. He had defended it against Mance Rayder's army and intended to do so again, albeit against a different foe. But the Night King was cunning. As if knowing Jon and anticipating his reactions, he predicted their actions. When the assault on the wall began, and it seemed the main attack was on Castle Black, the Night King, riding the undead Viserion, struck the defenses at Eastwatch by the Sea. sound of ice breaking from Viserion's magical flames could be heard for miles. Daenerys and Jon realized the Night King's plan to stretch their forces and strike where their dragons were not. Both riders quickly flew east, but it was too late. The wall had been breached. Upon arrival, they furiously unleashed their dragons, but the Night King's flying skills were on par with Daenerys's. The white cold, the weather that accompanied the others with heavy snow, icy rain, and strong winds, allowed the Night King to fight against 2 dragon riders. After a brief but fierce skirmish, the Night King, as if tired, landed near the White Walkers. Jon and Daenerys followed, intending to burn them all to ashes, but saw that they were already prepared with ice spears. Having no choice but to retreat, they turned their dragons and flew back to Winterfell. Thus, the Night King dealt the first blow to the living, breaching the main defense of the living world and invading Westeros. While Jon and Daenerys were at the wall, one of the new arrivals at Winterfell was Samwell Tarly. Though not a great fighter, the books he brought from the Citadel might hold the key to how the White Walkers were stopped during the Long Night in the past. Some masters from the Citadel had noticed that this winter was unique and were also seeking useful information, sending it by ravens. Sansa Stark, ruling Winterfell in Jon's absence, provided a space in the castle library for Sam, Tyrion, and those skilled in reading, ensuring they were not disturbed. Bran Stark, with the gift of the Three-Eyed Raven, spent his time in the Godswood, delving deeper into past events, trying to find answers and understand the Night King's goal. Sam hoped that with Bran's help, they could find the answers, but Tyrion noted that the more Bran delved into the past, the more detached he seemed to become. Another notable arrival at Winterfell, along with Jon and Daenerys, was Jaime Lannister. The rumor that the wall had been breached and the dead were now on this side spread along the King's Road, but still, many viewed the arriving contingent with suspicion and distrust. However, Sansa Stark, not without lessons from Petyr Baelish, had learned to view things without prejudice. She proposed Jaime Lannister to lead Winterfell's defense. Of all present, he had the most experience and had commanded an army of this size. Hearing this, echoes of discontent reverberated through the castle halls, but Sansa reminded them that all feuds needed to be set aside. The wall had fallen, and they needed to do everything possible to ensure Winterfell did not meet the same fate. Jaime wasted no time and began inspecting the defensive structures, but was dissatisfied with them. Together with Jon Royce, Grey Worm, and Jorah Mormont, they set to work. Upon their return, Jon and Daenerys recounted in detail what they had encountered over the past weeks. They also reported the details of the skirmish at Eastwatch against the Night King. An important piece of news was that they had noticed the army of the dead had not advanced south, but decided to clean up the remaining human strongholds along the wall. Jon and Daenerys said that those left in the fortifications on the wall could no longer be helped, and they needed to use this time wisely. Seeing that Sansa was managing the castle and people well, Jon decided to dedicate the remaining time to dragon riding training under Daenerys' guidance. On the 9th day after the wall fell, a small group led by Edison Tollett, Tormund, and Beric Dondarrion arrived at the castle. They brought the sad news that Castle Black had fallen to a two-sided attack, and the main force of the dead would soon move south. Hearing this, Jon ordered all non-combatants to head south to the Twins and River Run. That evening, in the castle's main tower, the heroes spread out a map and discussed their battle plan. Everyone stood silently around the table, glancing at each other. Jorah Mormont asked the first important question. Why were they so sure the Night King would assault Winterfell? He could bypass them and move further south or surround them, as his army of tens of thousands of dead could eventually starve or freeze them out. Samwell Tarly answered, saying the Night King was after Bran. The more time Bran had, the more chances he had to find a way to stop the White Walkers using his Three-Eyed Raven powers. Therefore, the Night King would hurry, as time was also against him. Varys proposed a sensible suggestion to take Bran south. But, unexpectedly, Bran spoke from the shadows, saying that for his gift to work, he needed the Weirwood tree in the Godswood. Without it, he couldn't delve far enough into the past, and added that he needed just a bit more time. Tyrion looked at his brother and Jon Royce, asking how they would act. Jaime began tracing his finger along the map, explaining his plan. He started by stating that they couldn't win in an open battle, but they didn't need to. All they had to do was destroy the Night King, to whom the dead were bound. Therefore, they created 3 lines of fortifications with a deep trench. The first line would be manned by Stark and Lannister troops and part of the Knights of the Vale. This would be the hardest hit. Slowing down the dead's horde, the troops would fall back to the second line, held by their best infantry, the Unsullied. They would be covered from the walls by archers armed with dragonglass-tipped arrows. The Dothraki would be divided into 3 groups, 2 on the flanks and 1 in reserve. Their task was to attack the army of the dead with dragonglass arrows from a distance, drawing part of the dead away from the main assault. After each maneuver and resupplying their arrows, they would repeat the attack. The wildlings, who were too few after the Battle of the Bastards and the battle at the wall against the Night King, would guard the armory and additional horses. If the first wave of the dead got bogged down in battles, the White Walkers would be forced to send a second wave. At this point, a small contingent hidden in the forest would come into play. The walkers always stayed behind the horde. When most were assaulting the castle, the remaining Knights of the Vale and the Night's Watch, led by their best fighters on horseback, would strike the walkers. They knew that each walker controlled a group of the dead. Killing them would ease the castle's defense by reducing the white numbers. Most importantly, engaging the White Walkers in battle would force the Night King, who usually stayed away from the fray, to enter the fight. Daenerys, who had been silent until now, suddenly said, "And then Jon and I will finish what we started. We'll deal with his dragon first, and when he lands, we'll use dragon fire, Valyrian steel, and dragon glass. Something will work." Everyone agreed it was the best plan they could devise. Past mistakes were considered, and feeling encouraged, the commanders dispersed. Sansa, Tyrion, Varys, Sam, and those not fighting said their farewells and headed south to the Twins. The troops received their orders and took up their positions. Torches were lit on the walls, sentries took their posts. Everyone prepared for the battle, understanding that the White Walkers had to be stopped at Winterfell. Meanwhile, unnoticed by Winterfell's defenders, thin, pale figures of riders appeared on the horizon atop the hill. As the troops finished taking their positions, small Dothraki units rode out from the castle to specially prepared bonfires around the perimeter of the valley in front of Winterfell. Their purpose was clear. Cold and darkness followed the army of the dead. As soon as the White Walkers reached the bonfires, the flames would start to extinguish, signaling where to expect the first wave of attack. This trick would prevent the dead from approaching the defenders unnoticed under the cover of darkness and blizzard. First, the fires to the west were lit, then those to the east, and the signal bonfires north of Winterfell had not yet bran lit. Bran Stark, accompanied by several knights and Theon Greyjoy, made his way to the Godswood of Winterfell. On his lap lay several parchments and quills. Theon asked Bran why he needed them, to which Bran replied that they contained notes on all the events he had seen in the past since arriving at Winterfell. If things went badly and he died at Winterfell, these records should be delivered to Sam and Tyrion. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, who were to the west of the castle and standing on a hill next to their dragons, noticed that the units that had ridden into the darkness to the north had still not lit the signal fires. A group of Night's Watchmen and Knights of the Vale hidden in the forest also watched the riders who had gone north but had lost sight of them. But soon Arya Stark and then the others heard the distinctive sound of clattering bones which grew louder and louder. This meant only one thing. The army of the dead was close, so they moved deeper into the forest and prepared for battle. Lannister troops, Stark soldiers, and dismounted Knights of the Vale set the deep trench in front of them alight. The tongues of fire made it difficult to see anything on the other side of the trench. But soon the front lines noticed the first wave of Whites approaching at great speed like an avalanche. Leaping over each other, as if driven by an unseen force, they slammed into the first rows of the human army. The battle for Winterfell had begun. As expected, the first blow was the heaviest. Along with the Whites, a strong frosty wind struck the humans. Despite the lit trench and the rows of stakes and other fortifications, the dead managed to reach the frontline troops. The fight was intense. For a while, the line of soldiers held, but the horde of the dead continued to press on in a massive wave. Some panicked, abandoning their positions and fleeing towards the castle. It was time for the Dothraki to join the fray. Several thousand riders charged towards the dead, unleashing a hail of arrows upon them. The strike was so powerful that the flanks of the dead were almost cleared. This gave the infantry time to regroup and carry the wounded into the castle. Following the first strike came the second. The Dothraki vividly demonstrated the danger of their cavalry, even against such a monstrous enemy. Meanwhile, Bran Stark was witnessing visions of the past. He traveled back 14,000 years, long before the first men reached the lands of Westeros. But these lands were not uninhabited. They were home to a mysterious non-human people. Small in stature but very agile, these were the beings who would be called the Children of the Forest. Bran had met their distant ancestors beyond the wall during his journey. They worshipped the old gods, nameless, faceless spirits of nature. the same ones that the descendants of the first men and the free folk would come to worship. The children of the forest did not build cities or stone castles. They lived deep in the forests, wearing garments made of leaves and shoes made of tree bark. The wise among the children of the forest were called green seers, possessing green sight, which could be called magic. This magic allowed them to have power over forest animals, birds, and other creatures. Jeor Mormont, the 997th Lord Commander, mentioned that the children of the forest could even speak to the dead. Their magic and way of life resembled the element of ice. Meanwhile, it seemed that things were going well for the living. After the second Dothraki attack came the third. The Lannister troops and Knights of the Vale retreated to the second main line of defense. The Unsullied, led by Grey Worm, prepared for their turn. But Jon, watching the fourth Dothraki attack on the eastern flank, froze in horror. The signal bonfires had been extinguished. He didn't realize when it had happened. At that same moment, Jaime Lannister noticed it from the castle walls. Through the veil of darkness, numerous silhouettes stirred. Then, the people saw thousands of blue lights in the dark, the horde of whites, along with giants on mammoths attacking their right flank. This became the turning point of the battle. The giants were clad in armor made by the others, crafted from the same material as their spears. The armor changed color with every movement, turning from white like freshly fallen snow to coal black to a greenish-gray hue. The Dothraki arrows could not penetrate such armor. They began to suffer serious losses and tried to retreat. The Unsullied redirected their forces to the east, preparing long spears made of dragonglass. The horde from the north was still being held back, but their numbers were growing. Daenerys told Jon that if they didn't intervene, Winterfell would be doomed. Therefore, they mounted their dragons and headed towards the battle to turn the tide in their favor. The group waiting in the forest saw Daenerys' dragon, Drogon, and Jon's dragon, Rhaegal, unleashing streams of hot flame upon their enemies. From their position, they saw that the first line of defense in the north was still holding, but since the riders had entered the fray before the Night King appeared, something had gone wrong with their plan. This meant they needed to strike as soon as possible. Mounting their horses, they rode to attack the White Walkers from behind, hoping that most of the Whites were already at Winterfell's walls. Bran, meanwhile, was witnessing the beginning of another war. 12,000 years ago, the first men landed on the shores of Westeros and began clearing forests and cutting down the faces from weirwood trees that frightened them. They disrupted the ancient natural order, like a wild flame, destroying the world and home of the children of the forest. In horror, the children of the forest began a war against the aggressive invaders. Using magic, they caused the sea to rise and swallow the land bridge through which the first men had come to the continent. But this did not stop the war, and this conflict lasted for centuries. Bran Stark watched as the children of the forest, being smaller in stature and physical strength, were at a disadvantage against the men. Their wooden and stone weapons were no match for bronze. Moreover, among the first men, there were those who also possessed unusual abilities, but it was a different kind of magic, resembling the element of fire. Gradually, the children of the forest were forced to retreat from the lands that the heroes knew as Dorne, further and further north. After hundreds of years, wise men from both peoples called for peace on the Isle of Faces. The children of the forest and the first men made a pact. The men received the shores, plains, and meadows, while the children of the forest retained the dense forest and forbade the cutting of weirwood trees. Over 4,000 years of friendship between the two peoples, the first men abandoned their gods brought from across the sea and began to worship the old gods. People gradually started learning the customs and magic of the children of the forest, and some learned to inhabit animals. Such people were called wargs, and the most capable gained the gift of green sight. They could not only leave their bodies and inhabit any living creature, but also see events in other places and times, and perform miracles like the destruction of the Arm of Dorne. Though the first men became spiritually close to the children of the forest, the incoming Andals from Essos did not honor the pact made many centuries ago. Leaders of the first men tried to reason with their kin, but their words fell on deaf ears. Westeros was once again divided, Andals against the children of the forest and the first men, and as before, the Southerners began pushing their enemies further north. Even the abilities of the Greenseers could not stop the hordes of men. The Andals worshipped the Seven and hated the religion of the first men and the old gods they revered. The Night King, whom they expected to see far from the battle, took advantage of Jon and Daenerys being distracted and joined the fight. Under the cover of the storm, he approached the castle and used his main weapon, the resurrection of the dead. The people had managed to bring the wounded within the castle walls, and many of them had died from their injuries. Those inside the walls didn't immediately understand what had happened when wights appeared in the courtyard of their fortifications. The defense of the people faltered. Jon noticed his main enemy hovering over the castle and directed his dragon into battle. Daenerys hurried to follow. At that moment, far from the castle, the White Walkers were caught off guard by the humans' attack. Armed with dragon glass blades, they broke through the ranks of wights and began killing the White Walkers one by one. The defenders of the castle noticed that in some areas, part of the dead turned to dust. But the attack had come too early. There were still too many wights covering the White Walkers. The storm and wind intensified, the squad lost formation, and very soon, no one knew where anyone was, which side the enemy was on, or where their allies were. Edison Tollett, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, fell in a skirmish with 2 White Walkers, trying to cover his men and lead them out of harm's way. Commanders Jaime Lannister and Jon Royce surveyed the battlefield from the walls around them. The Unsullied valiantly held back the advancing armies of the dead, but they were too few. The fortifications of the second line were almost crushed, and the Unsullied were retreating to the castle walls. The Dothraki on the western flank, having exhausted their arrows, engaged in close combat and began to suffer losses. Above, the dragons roared, and through the clouds the battle of the 3 riders could be seen. The attack on the White Walkers had stalled, and the second line of defense was on the verge of being broken. The situation was becoming desperate. They needed to start withdrawing troops through the southern gate immediately, otherwise everyone would be trapped. Ser Davos, who was at the southern gates, gave orders and began to lead the people away. The dragon battle in the air was becoming fiercer. Jon and Daenerys circled around the Night King, and he could no longer hide as easily in the fog and clouds as he did at Eastwatch by the Sea. Drogon and Rhaegal were getting wounded, but the undead Viserion was taking just as much damage. The Night King was expending a lot of energy to keep Viserion under control with his magic, and he was also weakened by the recent resurrection of the dead. Bran Stark continued to observe events of the past. About 8,000 years before the Battle of Winterfell, humans had pushed the Children of the Forest and their allies far north. Their numbers dwindled, and despair grew daily. The magic of the wargs and their animals could not stop the metal-clad armies of men. So, the Children of the Forest and the Green Seers decided to use old magic, communication with the dead. They managed to revive a recently killed man. He did not need sleep, did not tire, and could fight without rest. But maintaining life in such a state was difficult. The Children of the Forest were already too few, and they could only control small groups of such beings. Driven by desperation, they decided to create a creature from one of the men with the gift of green sight, who would have greater potential and could control an army of the dead. They just needed to find the right candidate. Bran realized that they were talking about the person who would come to be known as the Night King. In the present, the army of the dead was already storming the walls, and the defenders were holding them back with their last strength. Theon and his men held back the wights, trying to break through to the Godswood. He tried to wake Bran, but he was tightly entwined by the roots of the weirwood tree, and Theon could not cut them. He kept trying to free Bran, but his efforts were in vain. All he could do was pull out the papers on Bran's lap. His men were taking losses, and Theon had to make a decision: abandon Bran or stay with him to the end. Beric Dondarrion, who was fighting the White Walkers, saw the silhouettes of dragons above him. One crashed to the ground with a roar. Another hovered above it. Beric recognized the shape of the Night King. Daenerys struggled to get Drogon to his feet to take off, while Viserion prepared to burn her with his blue flame. But at that moment, Jon Snow appeared above the Night King on Rhaegal. Seeing the ice spear in his enemy's hand, capable of killing a dragon, Jon Snow shouted for Rhaegal to fly away, drew his sword, and jumped down. He knocked the Night King out of the saddle, and they both fell to the snowy ground. Daenerys saw several White Walkers with ice spears quickly approaching them. She shouted for Drogon to take off. Fending off the attacking wights, with a wild roar, Drogon flapped his wings, and with great difficulty due to his wounds, managed to ascend into the air. Jon Snow barely managed to get up from the ground. The Night King and several White Walkers were closing in on him. Beric Dondarrion reached Jon first on his horse, but the horse, weakened by the battle, couldn't carry them both. Without a second thought, Beric dismounted and helped Jon into the saddle. In a calm, indifferent voice, he told Jon farewell, saying that this was not the end, and the Lord of Light would watch over him. Striking the horse, the animal dashed into the blizzard towards the castle, while Beric Dondarrion, lighting his sword, headed towards the Night King, understanding that here, at the walls of Winterfell, his seventh and final life had come to an end. In his last moments, he was plagued by curiosity. Had the Lord of Light brought him back just so he could save Jon Snow? But he was not destined to know the answer. Jon reached the walls of Winterfell. The battle had moved within the castle. The survivors were trying to flee south. The Unsullied, not yielding to the onslaught of the dead, continued to fight, buying time for the others. Jon glimpsed Jaime Lannister, Brienne of Tarth, and a few other familiar faces. He himself made his way to the Godswood to rescue their main hope, Bran Stark. The Night King and the White Walkers were heading there as well. Bran Stark did not know that his time was running out. He watched a group of children of the forest who were discussing something. Next to them was a man, and Bran had seen fragments of this event before. This time, he walked into the man who was tied to an obelisk as he had done with Hodor.
Hold the door!
Through the man's voice, Bran asked, "How do you stop the one who leads the army of the dead?" The children of the forest, saying nothing and binding him with magic, took out a piece of ice that resembled obsidian and, whispering incomprehensible prayers, brought it to Bran's chest. As the previous three-eyed raven had warned him, Bran had stayed too long in the past and could not wake up.
You finally show me something I care about, and then you drag me away.
It is beautiful beneath the sea. But if you stay too long, you'll drown.
I wasn't drowning.
Bran tried to stop the children of the forest, but it was too late. The ice cut through the man's chest, and Bran felt a sharp pain he had never felt before. His head felt as if it had split in two, and then he felt a burning sensation on his marked arm, left by the Night King several months ago. After that, the pain suddenly subsided, everything around him became dark, and Bran opened his eyes in the present. Before him stood the same man he had warged into thousands of years ago, and Bran realized, with horror, that this was the Greenseer who had been turned into the Night King. That was why the Night King possessed the same abilities as Bran, could sense him, and could even touch him in his dreams. The Night King did not want to kill Bran, but to turn him into a White Walker. They were one and the same entity. Jon Snow reached the gates of the Godswood and saw the ranks of the dead surrounding the weirwood tree. He saw the Night King holding Bran by the hand. Something flitted past on the left, like a shadow, so quickly that even the White Walkers didn't react in time. Arya Stark, armed with a Valyrian steel dagger, leaped at the Night King. But when the Night King's body shattered into pieces of ice, nothing happened. Arya looked up and saw Bronn standing on his feet. His skin had turned pale, and his eyes had taken on an icy blue hue. His skull had become more pointed, and his facial features had grown thin and sharp. He was covered in ice, and in his hand was the Night King's spear. Arya let out a quiet gasp as the spear pierced her chest, and not fully believing what was happening, she fell dead. Jon, with the last of his strength, began to move toward Arya when Theon Greyjoy grabbed him from behind and, retreating, dragged him back. Taking advantage of the dead army's distraction, they escaped to the castle's main courtyard, where Daenerys had arrived on Drogon. With her on the dragon's back were Brienne of Tarth, Tormund, and Jorah Mormont. Climbing onto the dragon, they soared into the air, and before disappearing into the clouds, they saw how around Bran, the dead warriors who had fallen in the Battle of Winterfell were rising. Thus fell the North, the first kingdom of men. Well, that's it. I don't know how this video will perform. Considering that this channel is new, how this video will do, I have no idea. Although the first video on Elden Ring got over 1,000 views, which can be considered a big success. But even if it does well, was it interesting? So for those who watched until the end, give your feedback. Since all this is done purely out of enthusiasm and takes a lot of time and effort, it would be foolish to make the second and third parts for nothing. If you liked this video and want to see what happens next, likes and subscriptions are welcome. They They help promote the video and the channel overall. And for now, I wish you all a good morning, day, evening, or night. Till next time.